Hello, this is Heavy Friend. In this time, we'll look at ValueNotifier and StateNotifier, which are often used to handle state. ValueNotifier can be useful for handling simple state. In many examples, ValueNotifier is used with primitive values such as integer or string. In this section, we'll also look at examples of use with more complex data types such as classes. StateNotifier can be usefully used in provider package instead of change notifier, but it is also used very frequently in Riverpod package, which I personally think is promising in the future. When introducing StateNotifier this time, I will show an example of using it alone, not when using it with a state management package such as provider or Riverpod. First, the value notifier. According to the definition, value notifier type T is a change notifier having a value of type T. In fact, value notifier is a subclass of a change notifier. When the value of type T changes, value notifier plays a role of notifying listeners of the changed value. However, how to determine that the value has changed is done using the equality operator. In the case of primitive type, such as integer or string, the determination of equality is very simple. But in the case of a complex type, such as class, this determination is somewhat complicated. This will be covered in an example. And a value can be anything. So, value notifier is a notifier with relatively high flexibility. Constructor is a very simple form that has a single value as an argument, as shown in the figure. And as a main property, there is a value property. The value property is a read and write property. Also, since value notifier is a class of change notifier, methods of change notifier can be utilized. The add listener, dispose, remove listener, and notify listeners mentioned below will show actual usage example in upcoming examples. Here, notify listeners has a slightly different role from change notifier. In value notifier, when the value changes, that is, if the value has changed by the equality operator, it notifies listeners that the value has changed without using notify listeners. So you don't need to use notify listeners in most cases. However, there are cases where you have to use notify listeners in some cases. Let's look at such an example through an example. And you shouldn't call notify listeners when you don't need to. Unnecessary calling notify listeners can lead to unexpected situations. And if you want to give more functionalities to value notifier, you can extend the value notifier. Let's look at an example that extends the value notifier as well. Next, when the value notifier notifies you that the value has changed, we need to listen for changes in the value and take the appropriate action. Value notifier is a type of value listenable, and the widgets can listen for changed values using value listenable builder. A value listenable builder has a value listenable and builder as required arguments. Value listenable has an instance of value notifier to listen to as a value. Builder has build context, a new value read from value notifier, and optional child as arguments. Child specifies a widget that does not depend on value and requires a lot of resources to build. Proper use of the child argument can reduce the scope of rebuild. Now, let's look at an example. First, uncomment avoid print among the rules in the analysis options.yaml file so that the warning is not displayed even if print is used in the app. If you look at the screen, the first page consists of buttons that moves to the page that demonstrates a value notifier implemented in various ways. And each page is a stateful widget, a widget that displays the static content in the middle of the screen. First, let's look at main.dart. Material app's title is notifiers, and the debug banner is not displayed. My homepage is a stateless widget and consists of buttons that move to a page to test the value notifier implemented in various ways. Button style and navigation code are repeated, so I made a custom button widget. For custom button widget code, please refer to the source code posted on GitHub. Let's start with the primitive value notifier page.dart first. The example to be created on this page is the most common form in the tutorial that introduced the value notifier. And I will also create a code that utilizes the value notifiers and listener, remove listener, and dispose methods. First, declare an integer type value notifier final variable underscore counter and assign a value notifier instance with an initial value of 0. Then the value of the value property of the underscore counter will now be 0. To increase the value of value notifier, directly increase the value property of the underscore counter instance in the unpressed callback of the floating action button. As mentioned earlier, a value notifier has a value property, and the value property can be freely changed outside of value notifier. However, when the value of value notifier changes, listeners are notified that the value has changed. A widget that can listen to the changed value is a value listenable builder. After wrapping the center widget with an integer type value listenable builder, assign an underscore counter to the value listenable property, and return the center widget from the builder callback that has build context, integer type value, and the optional widget type child as arguments. And modify the text widget to display the change in counter value instead of 0. Let's do a hard restart and run it. Each time the floating action button is pressed, the counter value changes. Next, we want to create a function that displays a dialog when the value of the underscore counter instance becomes 3 and moves the other page when it becomes 5. First, we will create an underscore counter listener function of void type that performs this action. In the underscore counter listener function, if the underscore counter dot value is 3, a dialog displaying the value is displayed. And if the underscore counter value is 5, it moves to the other page. And in the initState function, register the underscore counter listener function by using the addListener function of the underscore counter. In this way, whenever the value of the underscore counter changes, the underscore counter listener function is called. Next, in the dispose function, use the remove listener function of the underscore counter to remove the underscore counter listener function, and then dispose the underscore counter. Let's run it after a hard restart. Let's press the floating action button. The moment it became 3, a dialog was displayed, and the moment it became 5, it moved to the other page. You have seen that you can do more than you think with a simple value notifier. Next, let's look at an example of using value notifier by extending it. Extending value notifier allows you to add various functionality to value notifier. First, we'll create a class that extends a value notifier of integer type called counter value notifier. After creating the class, a red squiggle line is displayed in the counter value notifier. When I clicked on the light-shaped icon, a main item called create constructor to call super.valueNotifier was displayed. I'm going to click on the menu item. Then the constructor was generated, and I will leave the constructor unchanged because I will provide an initial value from the outside. Next, we'll create a function called increment counter by 10 and set the new value by adding 10 to the value. Next, create the counter value notifier instance with an initial value of 0 and store it in the underscore counter variable. And we'll add 2 floating action buttons to the floating action button. For the first floating action button, we add 1 directly to the value of the underscore counter instance in the unpressed callback as we did before. And in the unpressed callback of the other floating action button, we call increment counter by 10 of the underscore counter instance. Next, wrap the center widget with an integer type value listener builder and replace 0 with value. And as in the previous example, we will add a function to display a dialog when count is 3 and move to the other page when count is 5. Let's do a hard restart and run it. When the value became 3, a dialog was displayed, and when it became 5, it moved to other page. When I come back and press the second floating action button, the count is incremented by 10.